We noted at the start of this unit in the module that we are a bit stuck for ways of understanding our collective nature, our mutual entanglements, our commitments to each other, and the degree to which we are non-independent of each other. And I suggested that we could look at animal models of sociality, and what we saw is that biological form does not determine the form of social organization. We're not destined to be either chimpanzees or ants, despite the fears of the Victorians, but we were landed a problem by Charles Darwin, who told us that we are animals, and we still don't understand that. We live at a time in which vast numbers of species are going extinct, and planetary conditions are changing beyond all recognition, such that human society will have to substantially reorganize. Under such conditions, new ways of thinking are going to be needed. We then looked at the motivations and shortcomings of social psychology, in which we assume that the individual is preformed, has a singular mind, usually conceived of as some kind of internal place. And we saw that social psychology responds always to collective fears, because we turn to psychologists as we turn to priests and astrologers for help. But we saw some dreadful science, to be honest with you, and we saw that we're going to have to do better than that. So under these conditions, it would be remiss of me if I was to suggest that that's our options. We can either be confused animals or lousy social psychologists. There are other options, and there are other ways of thinking about ourselves. And if you get one thing from this module, it's that there are multiple ways of understanding ourselves, no single way that can be wielded with authority. What I want to do here is just point you, I can only give a brief pointer to very substantial alternative ways of viewing ourselves that are currently under development within cognitive science and related fields. And in essence, what they're going to do is provide the beginnings of alternative ways of thinking about ourselves and speaking about ourselves. But extricating ourselves from this position is not easy, because an individualist psychology built on old-fashioned Christian theological notions of the individual human autonomous Protestant soul, because the psychology has always been also been soul science, that's just not good enough. So we do need to characterize ourselves, but what do we see when we look in the mirror? Well, in the middle there you see Vitruvian man, the abstract ideal, totally self-contained, perfect human male individual that functioned as kind of an ideal after the Renaissance and in the building of modernity. On the right-hand side you see a surrealist painting illustrating perhaps that things are a little bit more complicated. So how do you know how can you even spot which narrative is operative? Well, one thing to be aware of is that our everyday talk carries with it the history of this construction of the individual, the self-contained human, which is an insufficient picture. When you see people talking, as we will, of perception as input, of cognition as something hidden from the world, and as action as followed as the consequence of cognition or thought. Perception in, action out, and cognition as some kind of middle bit. You're dealing with the cognitive sandwich, which has been lampooned by the philosopher Susan Hurley. It is a somewhat unbelievable model, and yet it also contains within it the terms by which we think about ourselves. So we need to be cautious in building our story. We have a tendency to attribute to the brain incredible magical powers that we have no scientific grasp on. And in so doing, if you attribute all the magic of the universe to one organ, you omit all the other magic of the universe and the complexity of our situation. Excessively neurocentric accounts of the person create a kind of an artificial view of the person, a monster, as I said. And these stories can be developed and can be sold. You can make money with them, and people can be controlled by them. So while we think of ourselves very often in these terms, we like to think of ourselves as completely autonomous, as having private cogitations which will lead to us behaving, we have to recognize that there are gross limits to that. And so what are some of the other alternatives that are out there? Well, one thing we find is that the way that we talk about minds matters. Our everyday talk is a ragtag mixture of folk beliefs, well-meant scientific work, idiosyncratic nonsense, and comforting half-truths. So the way in which we talk about minds is going to matter, particularly when it comes to asserting any kind of scientific authority, for example. If neurocentrism is the problem of attributing everything to the nervous system, the whole spirit, person, consciousness to the nervous system, that's neurocentrism. It's a problem. If we don't talk about that, then our talk about minds, the mental, can be seen to extend out into the world. This point was made in a famous paper by Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers called the extended mind hypothesis. And what they did in this paper is show that the way that we talk about ourselves naturally includes the world. If you ask me what I know, we've noted this before, an awful lot of what I know simply because some parts of the world are there, like my computers, my laptops, my books, and so on. Strip me of everything like that, and I know very little indeed. Vygotsky was also telling us something very similar to this. And taking that perspective as one perspective to explore gives us a way to rethink some questions about minds that suffer less from this problem of neurocentrism. So the extended mind hypothesis can work in many ways, and it can work even in a fairly standard psychological account as long as we don't start just attributing magic stuff to the brain. If we want to discuss something like cognition, and in conventional terms like perceiving, remembering, planning, and solving, and we look at what's involved when we perceive, when we remember, when we plan, when we solve, and so on, we find that, well, things in the world are involved. Tools are involved. We use our bodies even as mnemonic devices. Writing has completely populated our minds in many respects. The degree to which you are separable from your mobile phone and your computer is, well, it's debatable. If you interact with such technologies and rely on them for what you say, what you think, then to some extent they are part of you, as long as we're being generous with this notion of you. So the extended mind hypothesis is one interesting move. We've noted at several places in this module so far that there are alternatives to extreme neurocentric views, and they tend to go by the very loose label of embodied cognitive science. This comes in many, many flavors. There's no single theory of embodied cognitive science. Rather, we're referring to a whole bunch of approaches which don't treat the brain as magical. As important as it is, it's an organ of the body. And cognition is something that happens to a person and not to a brain. Remembering, seeing, feeling, thinking, hoping, planning, dreaming are activities of a person and not activities of the brain. On this view, we need to get over certain metaphors we think about, certain metaphors about the inside of the mind, for example. And that's why in this little diagram you can see, if we're talking about cognition, we're talking about something that goes between the body and the world. And some embodied cognitive theories begin to dismantle the psychological vocabulary and replace it with new terms. Very often perceiving here is seen as a kind of an interaction, as an activity, an interaction with the world. You remember when we started discussing perception, one of the first things we noted was the inseparability of perception and action. Well, some embodied cognitive theorists take this further. But it's necessary to undo some habits of thought, in particular of thinking of the mind as a place where things are stored, as a place where my ideas go on. Instead, our mental talk is talk of various kinds of activity that extend across the body and the world. One school within the broad church of embodied cognitive science theories is a really interesting one, which I've found very useful, which is the theory of enaction. Enaction means to bring into being by doing. It's a very simple idea at its heart. Let's take the business of a parade, for example. How do you know if you have a parade? Well, not how do you know if you have a parade? How do you have a parade? Well, you can draw a parade, and you can make plans for a parade, and you can make the costumes for the parade, and you can apply for planning permission for the parade. You can talk about the parade, you can tweet about the parade, but the only way to have a parade is to get out there and do it. You have to enact a parade. You have to bring it into being by doing. All the talk in the world won't do that for you. That's at the heart of enaction, which is that living is a process of becoming, of bringing into being by doing. And on this view, which is strongly based in biology and not in psychology, and has its roots in Buddhist epistemology rather than Christian epistemology, this psychological language gets translated. So that when a lot of our conventional talk about perceiving, for example, is often re-expressed as sense-making. And in the picture here, you can see on the left, you can see a circle which represents a system of some kind. It could be a body, it could be a bug, it could be a human body, it could be any organized autonomous entity which keeps itself going, persists through regulated exchange with its environment. So the wavy line is the environment, the double arrow is the regulated exchange, and the circle gives you a system. This is a powerful way of talking about what life is at the cellular level, and it extends and is being developed in multiple ways to talk about life at our level. It extends nicely to the question of the collectives. You recall that the problem we're facing is recognizing or having a vocabulary adequate to our collective being. But the simple notion of sense-making extends to participatory sense-making in which we enact the world together. So the world literally is enacted here. Don't think of the world as something pre-existing, but something that arises through the activity of living beings. So that's really, really useful. It represents a significant change in how we view ourselves and talk about ourselves. But we need multiple viewpoints at the moment. We need to understand the interdependencies of living beings. Typically in enaction, there's less talk of minds. If you reify the mind, if you say the mind is a thing, you've already sort of created yourself a problem. By speaking of sense-making, it turns out we can tell different stories, and stories that work quite well at a level of a single cell, of an organ, of a body, and even of communities and socialities. So, for example, enaction has very powerful ways of retelling the story of evolution, re-understanding what Darwin taught us, that make it clear that this hummingbird, for example, and the flower have a shared history. That you cannot understand the flower without understanding the hummingbird, and you cannot understand the hummingbird without understanding the flower. Their shared evolutionary history has given rise to both the beak of the bird and the trumpet of the flower. So this kind of entanglement is very difficult to express in a strongly individualistic vocabulary, but enaction lends itself quite well. This is early days, it's work in the making. There's so many new directions. One popular label used to group a lot of the embodied approaches together is 4E. The four canonical E's are embodied, obviously, enacted, as we just saw, extended, as we just saw, and embedded, meaning you can only make sense of things in context. Other people have tried to add other E's and even other letters. It's a bit like the LGBTIQQRSWXYZ problem. But 4E seems to be stabilizing as a label, so you may see that used. What's important here to note is that science tells many stories. Science is not a single oracle that gives us a single picture of truth, all the way from physics to the fantasies of cognitive psychology. Science will not tell you who you are or how you work, or what you're capable of, or how you should live. Science is a useful tool. It's a very, very useful way to act together consensually, to form a shared view of what's real, and to agree on what needs to be done. But it's like that. It's a tool, it's a means to reach that kind of consensus. One benefit you might get from studying cognitive science is to recognize this plurality of accounts. It's a bit dizzying at times, I'm not going to hide that. But it's also necessary when you realize that any single fixed view of the person is going to be limited. We construct very many images of ourselves, we tell very many stories, and no one should be able to dictate to you the story that you tell of your own life. So much for social cognition. Onwards.